Hi, this is a brief guest lecture on conservation genetics. Specifically, today we're going to have a look at two things. We're going to have a look at just an introduction to conservation genetics. And once you know what it is, we need to talk about why it's important. Why do we need to use genetic data to stop species going extinct? Why would we care? So, for those of you who haven't done any subjects with me, my name is Vince. That is my email. Feel free to email me on it. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so generally I'm not doing office hours unless there's an absolute necessity. If you are interested in anything from this lecture, hit me up. I'm a huge genetics nerd. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm very happy to talk to you about it. So basically, in the next about hour, we're going to have a look at conservation, the importance of genetic diversity, and we'll have a look at a few case studies of what you can use genetic knowledge to do when you're trying to keep things alive. So basically, why do we need to do conservation? Well, we are living in the middle of what is called the sixth great extinction. Um, so the rate at which species are currently going extinct is similar in magnitude, so it's about the same as the last five times in the geological record when there were mass extinctions. What that means is that people are as bad for the biodiversity on the planet, for the living things on the planet, as a gigantic meteor smashing into the planet, creating an impact winter and sending the dinosaurs extinct. That's what we're doing. The process of extinction and speciation, so species dying out and new species being formed by evolution, is usually maintained by a balance. But at the moment, that balance is not functioning. It's not functioning specifically because we have mass extinctions caused by human factors. So we're in the middle of a large problem. To give you guys a scale of the problem, let's have a look at some true news. Um, Land degradation impacts 75% of all terrestrial ecosystems. Three quarters of all the land mass on the Earth is degraded land. That at the moment is reducing the welfare of just over 3 billion people. Bees and other pollinators, and we need bees because without bees, many plants can't reproduce, are currently under threat globally. In fact, there's a massive bee die-off globally, and we're not really sure how to fix it. Overfishing and plastic pollution are massively threatening our oceans. We now have anoxic zones or dead spots in the ocean, and they've more than quadrupled in the last 25 years. Um, Between 1970 and 2018, 60% of all wildlife has disappeared. So if we do that again, by the end of your lifetime, there will be no wildlife at all. Uh, the Living Plant Index recorded a decline of 60% in species population sizes of plants between 1970 and 2014. So we're actually doing slightly worse in plants than we're doing in animals because it only took us, it took us 2 years less to get rid of 60% of all of them. Freshwater Living Plant Index and freshwater ecosystems are incredibly important because it's where we get our drinking water. Shows a decline of 83% since 1970. Basically, humans are wrecking balling the planet. We are going in and smashing stuff, and we are not fixing it, and that is causing problems not just for us, but it's certainly causing problems for us. This is impacting human welfare. It's causing problems for most of the species on the planet. That's why we need to do conservation. Um, if I give you numbers, they're scary, but for most people, numbers that big don't mean very much. So these guys, pink-eyed and tortoise, the eastern cougar, the Vietnamese rhino, none of these exist anymore in the wild. These are gone. These species are extinct. And these are iconic species. These are things you would have seen in textbooks as a kid. As are these guys, longjaw tristotemula, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, the blackface honey creeper. Everybody knows the western black rhino, the Yangtze River dolphin, the robber frog, very cool species, also gone. There are thousands more species that are extinct. One of the problems is that we are driving extinction so quickly at the moment that our efforts to classify species can't keep up. So we are literally losing species faster than we can describe them. And that's a large problem. A couple of quick questions for you to consider. Normally I would get you to actually answer these, but it's a little difficult right now. Once populations are extinct, can they be reintroduced? How easy is it? Once species are extinct, can they be reintroduced? So there is a difference between a population and species, right? You can lose a population from an area and then you can put it back, in theory. In practice, you can do it and it works. It is difficult to do. Part of the reason for that is that even if the species is the same, the populations are typically adapted to their environments. So moving individuals in from another population is possible, and if you have no other alternative, that's what you do, but it is difficult, it is costly, and it does not always succeed. Once species are extinct, can they be reintroduced? Right, I'm sure everybody here has seen one of the 87 Jurassic Park movies. Great movies, bullshit idea. Even where we can clone an individual, you would have an individual. One, without the ability to produce offspring. If you were able to clone 2 or 3, you're making a population from a very small number of individuals. That creates a lot of problems. Those problems are associated with inbreeding. We'll talk about those later in the lecture. Species reintroduction is a lovely idea in theory. In practice, it does not work at the moment. It may work in the future, but probably not. There also has to be an ecosystem for those species to return to, because nothing lives in isolation. And so that's another massive challenge. How do we ensure that there are areas to put species back into? Now, this is not just difficult in terms of Jurassic Park stuff. If we talk about species that are extinct in the wild and still live in captivity, reintroducing those to the wild is possible, but is incredibly difficult. The far better solution is to never lose species from the wild to begin with. Sorry about my dog in the background. So I'm Greek by descent, and in Greece we have a story, and the story is of Pandora's box. It's an ancient myth. Pandora opened a box she wasn't meant to open, and all of the evils of the world came out, and the last thing that came out of the box is hope. And the reason I say that now, after giving you guys a bunch of really depressing shit, is because we have started to see in the last generation and a half, 2 generations, a change. So a book called Silent Spring came out in 1962. This really started the environmental and the conservation movement in the West, so in Western society. Obviously, native peoples, various places, had much more sustainable practices, but Europeans didn't. And anywhere where Europeans went, adopted European beliefs and were very happy destroying and sacrificing the environment for economic progress. That continued. We started to see some pushback last century, but really 1962 was when things started to change at a very large level. So the book looked at the effects of pesticide on birds, and it found that this pesticide DDT, which was really good at killing insects, accumulated in the insects. And so the birds that ate the insects picked up a bunch of the pesticide and the birds died, and it was spring and there was no bird singing. You're meant to be able to hear birds singing in spring. If you don't, 60% of all wildlife has been lost. From that book, President Kennedy in the States tasked the Science Advisory Committee with reviewing the claims, and because of that, in 1972, DDT was banned. It kicked off a larger movement, though. 1966, first Endangered Species Act passed. 1968 was the first Biosphere Conference. 1970 was the first Earth Day. 1987, if we skip forward a little bit, was a protocol limiting ozone-depleting gases, and things went really well for a while until, that reversed in the last couple of world leaders in a dozen countries. In 1995, there was absolute scientific consensus on the causes of climate change. Just say that again for your crazy auntie who posts things on Facebook. In 1995, there was scientific consensus on the causes of climate change, and also how bad it was going to be. We are now seeing people who care about the environment enough that they are pushing their government to care about the environment protect the environment and conserve the environment for future generations. This has continued. In 2003, the EU ratified the first carbon emission trading laws. Now, we know that a bunch of those have been repealed since then, but they worked incredibly well. All of the analysis says carbon laws work to bring down carbon dioxide emissions. That helps to reverse climate change, or at least to slow climate change, to minimize climate change, and to keep species alive. In 2018, NASA showed that the Montreal Protocol was working. There were 20% less ozone-depleting chemicals in the atmosphere since 2005. There's been other things within countries. So the Green Belt movement in Kenya is a huge win. That movement by itself has planted more than 50 million trees. Why do I tell you guys this? I like to call you the heroes that we need. And I realize that's a cheesy picture. You are the best educated, the most interconnected, and the most globally aware generation in history. You know the most, you are the most connected to each other in government, and you care the most. You're also the generation that is able to change faster than anything we have ever seen before. And you place a higher priority on the environment than any previous generation. What does that mean? It means that we are trusting you to save the planet, because if you don't, it won't be saved. So good luck with that. And also deal with crippling student debt and a lack of increase in wages in the last 20 years while you're doing it. Why would we actually want to conserve biodiversity? Well, firstly, because biodiversity is spectacular and wonderful. As far as we know, there is one place in the universe where there is living things, and that's an awesome responsibility and a privilege. And so looking after those living things is incredible. I get, though, that not everybody is a huge hippie like me. So if you don't like nature, if you think animals suck, if you hate plants, if you once got bitten by a bird and you're still angry, there are other reasons to conserve biodiversity. Ecosystem services, clean air, clean water, food, are worth about $38 trillion a year. The cost-benefit analysis to conservation, so how much return do you get for every dollar you put in? You get about $100 return for every dollar you put into conservation. It is the best investment on the planet at the moment. Half of the 150 most important drugs on the North American market contain ingredients derived from living organisms. In fact, the COVID vaccines that are currently being tested are also being tested with an extract from horseshoe crab blood, because that's how we make sure our vaccines are safe. We don't have the biodiversity, we don't have these things. How many more incredible opportunities are there in living things? We don't know. What we do know is that there's a number of species that don't age. If we can figure out how they can do that, we don't necessarily have to age, which would be really interesting. World fish catch is worth about $60 billion a year. Ecotourism is worth about $3.6 billion a year in one small country. Even if you don't care about the environment, you should be looking to conserve the environment because we need it to function. Okay, so time to understand the place of genetics in conservation. If you are a Harry Potter fan, and if you are not a Harry Potter fan, I don't know how to help you. There's nothing we can do. Ron Weasley has been alive for longer canonically than conservation genetics has been accepted as a discipline. It is a relatively young field. It was really established in the early 90s. So in the late 80s, there was a paper published by a guy called Landy, who's generally brilliant, but he said that extinctions are caused by demographic and environmental fluctuations and catastrophes, and genetic factors really don't matter. You don't need to know about DNA to keep species alive. Back when most of your parents were in school. So how do we know genetics is important? Firstly, many surviving populations are genetically compromised. Secondly, when we deliberately inbreed animal lineages and plant lineages, when we have deliberate inbreeding, it causes extinctions in populations. We know this because we've done it in labs. Lastly, inbreeding is known to have contributed to the extinction of some wild populations and is implicated in many more. So there is really solid evidence, including just straight up lab experiments, that when you lack genetic diversity, inbreeding is a really good way to get rid of genetic diversity, you cause extinction. You compromise the ability of a species to survive. They went a little bit further. They did computer simulations that show that genetic factors are really important in extinction. We know that loss of genetic diversity increases susceptibility of populations when the environments change. Because when an environment changes, in order to adapt to that, population needs to have genetic diversity. The less diversity it has, the less able it is to adapt. So instead of adapting, it goes extinct. Now obviously, the faster the environment changes, the more genetic diversity you need to have. And at the moment, with climate change, we are changing the environment very quickly. Lastly, and probably most compellingly, outcrossing, or what we call genetic rescue, which is a very simple process, has been shown to lead to recovery of inbred populations, both in the lab and in the wild. So we've seen that when you fix genetic problems, you increase species survival. One of the reasons with this is what we call the extinction vortex. The extinction vortex is the slow spiraling of a species towards extinction. Typically, things don't go extinct overnight. Their populations shrink, and then you start losing populations, and then you lose the species. Obviously, there are threats like environmental stochasticity, changes in the environment, floods and fires, demographic stochasticity. So if there's only 10 individuals in a generation, they're all born male, that's it, species done. Catastrophes and genetic factors are a part of this. In small populations, you tend to have inbreeding. You can't help but mate with related individuals because there's not a lot of individuals. You have genetic drift. Genetic drift is just random chance. Both of those things are going to reduce the amount of genetic diversity. When you reduce the amount of genetic diversity, we know that individuals in the population are less good at surviving and reproducing. So when individuals are less good at surviving and reproducing, the population gets smaller, and this keeps cycling down. Think of water going down a drain, except the drain is utter extinction, and the water is species on the planet. So it's bad. Are genetic factors the only factors that drive extinctions of populations? Of course not. Were they important to rhino extinctions? Yes. Poaching, also very important to rhino extinctions. The ivory trade, very important to rhino extinctions. Clearing land for farming and shooting animals that got on that land, very important to rhino extinctions. Why would genetic diversity be important? And again, depends what your background here is, but basically, genetic diversity is the raw material for evolution. No genetic diversity, no evolution. No evolution, species will typically go extinct. There are a number of reasons why it's important. Genetic diversity contributes to disease resistance. It contributes to mate choice. But having diversity in a population allows that population to adapt when the environment changes. So this is just my genetic diversity as a raw material for evolution. Basically, evolution is just selection times genetic diversity times time. Selection is some individuals surviving and some dying. Genetic diversity, time. So, like any math, if one of these things equals 0, you have a large problem. Small inbred populations tend to lack genetic diversity. Great example is the female hawksbill turtle. If you have a look for hawksbill turtle on the internet, you'll find more image results than there are hawksbill turtles in the world. There are only about 1,000 females nesting every year. We do not have a big population of these things. That means this population is going to lack genetic diversity, which means this number in the middle here is going to be very small. When you multiply by a very small proportion, 0 point something something something, you decrease your final answer. Lack of genetic diversity limits evolution. The next thing that we want to understand is inbreeding, and this is an inbred cat. Get it? I suck. Inbreeding is production of offspring from individuals that are related by descent. And we know that when individuals that are related by descent have kids together, those kids are less likely to be good at surviving and reproducing. We call this inbreeding depression. There's been a couple of papers on this, so if you're really keen, look at Raz and Ballou in 1983. They looked at 44 mammalian species, And they found that more juveniles died when there was inbreeding in 41 of those species. There was an experiment done on brother-sister matings which showed that one generation of brother-sister matings decreased juvenile survival by a third. And inbreeding depression has been documented in 141 of 157 wild populations studied. So inbreeding causes inbreeding depression. Why does it do that? I'm going to have a look at a little bit of genetic theory here, but I will do my best to make it very accessible for you guys. Most animal and plant species are diploid, which means they have 2 copies of each chromosome, which means they have 2 copies of each allele. Some of you guys would have heard the term gene. Geneticists tend to use the term allele. So individuals typically have 2 alleles at locus. You can be homozygote, your alleles are the same. You can be heterozygote, your alleles are different. There is a problem with the word gene, and it's why we don't use it very much in genetics. Exactly the same problem as with the word love. This is my dog, my wife, my grandmother, motorcycles, and cinnamon buns. I love my dog, my wife, my grandmother, motorcycles, and cinnamon buns. If I want to do the same thing with my dog, my wife, my grandma, my motorcycle, and cinnamon buns, there is a very large problem and I need to seek professional help. The word love is so overused that it doesn't have a specific meaning anymore. The word gene is exactly the same. In genetics, we tend to talk about alleles, loci, or locus is the singular of that, and chromosomes, not genes. The word doesn't have a meaning. So we use the word alleles. All right, what we have to do next is we have to construct a family tree, or what we would call a pedigree. So in pedigrees, males are squares. I have no idea why. Females are circles. Again, I have no idea why. And when you have a mating event, we show that by a horizontal line. A vertical line will show that they've produced offspring. All right, guys, grab a cup of tea and come back for part 2.